So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another panel discussion of the Afghanistan Institute of Strategic Studies. My name is Kambaiz Rafi. I'm a political economist and a postdoctoral fellow at SOAS University of London. Today's topic is on Qatar's role in the US-Taliban negotiations. Now, Qatar's name was it almost became a byword with the negotiations between the US and the Taliban, an effort that saw a clear uptake during the US President Barack Obama's administration to end the US international military presence in Afghanistan after nearly 2 decades. Qatar's role in these efforts was so significant that the capital of Qatar, Doha, unofficially gave its name to the agreement that was reached between the US and the Taliban in February 2020, officially called the Agreement for Bringing Peace in Afghanistan. The country has hosted senior members of the Taliban group since 2010, and it has sort of played an outsized role in the diplomatic efforts vis-a-vis the Taliban group. And it also hosted regimes after that they had the only office representing them outside in the international arena in 2013, and the country has sort of played a role that it did not play in during the first Taliban regime. Qatar was not among the 3 countries that recognized the Taliban's first regime in the 1990s. But somehow in the post-2001 US-led international engagement in Afghanistan, and within that context, Qatar's potential as a mediator has been co-opted notably by the US to strike a political settlement with the Taliban with the objective of ending the Taliban's anti-government militancy and so on and so forth. However, to what extent Qatar has remained neutral in these negotiations? Has it tried to maintain the balance between the US and the Taliban on the one hand, and the Afghan Republican government on the other? Or has it tried to somehow align itself with one of the parties in these processes? To tackle these questions as this theme, today we have a diverse group of panelists. We have Dr. Nilofar Sakhi, professorial lecturer at George Washington University and visiting fellow at the Koch Institute, University of Notre Dame. Dr. David Roberts, associate professor at King's College London, and leading the regional security and development research in the School of Security Studies. And Mr. Abdullah Khenjani, who was a Deputy State Minister for Peace during the former Afghanistan Republic. We have Camilla and Khalifar, who unfortunately hasn't been able to join us due to technical issues. We hope that she does. We have Bill Raggio from Small Wars Journal, who unfortunately had to drop out last minute due to a health emergency. We hope that that is resolved for Bill. We also invite representative, but unfortunately they could not, but they promised to join AISS for future discussions. So the panel is organized as such that I will be referring a team to particular panelists who will be giving an opening remark for between 5 to 10 minutes. And then we will open up for Q&A. I would also encourage the panelists to note down any questions that they might have regarding the opening remarks by other members of the panel. It's meant to be a lively debate between the panelists and the audience. The audience could write their comments, their questions as comment, either here or in our live streaming on Twitter and on Facebook. So in the interest of time, I would refer my first question to Dr. Nilofar Sakhi to sort of give a context to today's panel discussion by by describing Qatar's foreign relation with Afghanistan, regardless of the Taliban negotiations. So how Qatar as a nation state built its foreign relations, foreign policy vis-a-vis Afghanistan as another nation. So during, with a focus on 2001 to 2021. This is the period where many countries entered Afghanistan, engaged with the US-led international effort to rebuild Afghanistan and many of its aspects. So how was Qatar's role in this in these efforts? Dr. Sakhi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Rafi, and thank you, Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies, for having me here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are joining us. As you asked me to provide a context about Qatar's role in Afghanistan from early 2003 to onwards, I would like to provide a context from two perspectives, from a peacemaking perspective and from political perspective. From peacemaking perspective, before jumping into Qatar's role, there are countries in the world who play a role of mediators in the international conflict. And we have those countries in the East and the West, and they are, their role is to play, bring convening meetings among different varying parties and provide value. The neutrality is very important in that processes. So Qatar is among one of those countries in the world who actually play a mediator role. Some other countries are, that in that list is Germany, Norway, Ireland, Qatar comes among them. And their role is really to resolve conflict, but not as a stakeholder in the particular process, as a neutral party. And they provide value. The simple offer that they can do is provide value. In some cases, they also monitor the deal when the deal is signed. So that is a broader context of Qatar's role in the mediation processes that comes under peacemaking. Qatar got a lot of attention in this particular field that I explained after it is mediation in countries like Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria. It got a lot of world attention after intervening as a mediator in this particular conflicts of the world. And that gave credibility of this particular role of Qatar as a mediator at the international stage. Why countries, have this role? I would like to come to that, and then to Qatar's role in Afghanistan. They actually, that becomes a central element of their foreign policy. In relation to Qatar, Qatar adapted its permanent constitution in April 2003. And in Article 7 of Qatar foreign policy, it's clearly indicated that Qatar would play a role of a mediator in resolving international conflict. So that's a central theme. Playing a mediator role for Qatar is a central theme in its foreign policy mandate. And that is mentioned in its constitution. So that is coming under Qatar's role as an intervener in various conflicts around the world as a neutral party. And from peacemaking perspective, we are calling it a mediator. Now, coming to Afghanistan. Well, in Afghanistan, there were 3 other countries initially from 2003 onwards, not 3, let's put it in a very better context, 2008 and 9, where they were trying to convince the government of Afghanistan and the United States to play a role of a mediator and convene negotiations between the varying parties at that time, the Taliban, United States, and other parties also were involved, like Hizb Islami was there at that time, and the government of Afghanistan. So they were the parties in conflict, and the countries approached the government to play a role of mediator. Another actually reality about this mediating role, that the countries should accept whoever is coming with that proposal. So the government of Afghanistan had to accept a country who came with a proposal of playing a role of a mediator. President Hamid Karzai had the role at that time when the countries approached him to play that role, the role of mediator, and some countries approached directly the United States for playing the role of mediator, and the region and the region of Afghanistan. Pakistan was there, Saudis were there, Saudi Arabia was there, and Qatar was there, Oman was there. So they were the countries actually who were interested to play a role of mediator between the parties. At that time, there was no title of mediation, but there was a venue to provide negotiation between the varying parties. And in 2010, by the way, there was all issue about the prisoner release between the Taliban and the United States that Germany played a role. So overall, these countries have to approach and get the approval from the country who has a direct stake in the conflict. Qatar started, it is approaching the governments both in Afghanistan as well as the other varying parties in 2009. And I would say other way. Germany actually started bringing Qatar in the process. And these countries are putting a proposal. For example, Qatar had a proposal that it would convene a mediation processes and negotiation processes for, of course, they have reasons behind that. First, to have the reputation and credibility at the international stage. Second, to gather resources for their countries. That's how the countries are coming in this role and proposing this role. So for Qatar, what happened that Taliban representatives after 2001 and 2, most of them are in Pakistan. From 2003 onwards, 3-4 onwards, when some sanctions were removed from some high-ranked members of the Taliban, they moved to Qatar. So some members of the Taliban from Pakistan, they started their lives in Qatar. They started their businesses, they started living there, they started their setup there. So there was a backup, there was a support mechanism for the Taliban in Qatar from 2004-5 onwards. That actually created a base for Qataris to get involved. I think what I would see based on the facts that I read, and based on my own involvement in the peace processes from 2010 onwards. So that was a base for Qatar to get involved. That created a relationship initially between the Taliban and Qatari government and Qatar overall. So that goes back before 2010, where the first negotiation between the varying parties happened in Doha. So therefore, I would say that the relationship was there. And I'm going to come to the neutrality elements, that whether Qatar played the role of neutral based on this relationship that started from 2005-6 onwards. And 2009, German government approached Qatar to convene the German government actually created relationship with a high-ranking Taliban official, and they wanted them to meet with the State Department for the prisoner release, for the exchange of prisoners, which at that time there was an issue with United States wanted the release of Sergeant Baghdal, and the Taliban wanted the release of their, I think, 10 highly ranked members from Guantanamo Bay. So that was the whole issue between the United States and the Taliban at that time, and the negotiation had to happen for that prisoner swap. So the German government convened that particular negotiations in Doha. And so part of the agreement after those particular negotiations between the Taliban and the United States at that time was the prisoner release, and the other demand by the Taliban was the start of a political office for them in Doha. So there were two elements attached to that particular kind of an agreement and the process that initially started, and that led to actually received quite of criticism and resistance from President Karzai of that time. And President Karzai did not want that office initially to be open in Doha. And on the other hand, there was also conditions from the United States and the Afghan government for the start of that office, political office. The Taliban would cut tie, even at that time, the Taliban would cut tie with all transnational terrorist groups. And they don't use that office for any other political purpose, only for the negotiations. So that was kind of conditions from these two other entities in the conflict, involved in the conflict, for the creation of the Doha office. So, but eventually that particular negotiation for the prisoner swap led to the creation of the Doha office for the Taliban, which started in 2013, the establishment of the office. So the relationship goes back to 2005-6, as I mentioned, with the Taliban starting their lives in Doha, and then led to a German intervention and bringing Taliban to the United States for the prisoner swap on the negotiation table, and then led to the establishment of this office in 2013. And that's where the relationship starts. And now from that from that time onwards, there has been a relationship between the Taliban and the Qatar in general. So that is a peacemaking context where Qatar got involved in Afghanistan, both from its foreign policy angle, its role in mediation and peacemaking, and overall its relationship with the one varying party, which was Taliban at that time. So do you want me to stop here? Or I should continue with their role and the Qatar role as a neutral role in the process, Dr. Rafi?
Please go ahead if you want to. I would invite to reflect on the sort of the larger, regardless of the negotiations, if I may, whether Qatar played in any other role in terms of rebuilding Afghanistan. As you have witnessed, regional countries, European countries, and countries beyond have played different roles in terms of, for instance, Germany pitched in to rebuild Afghanistan's police force. US played in quite huge sums to rebuild Afghanistan's armed forces. India played its part, Pakistan, Iran. Did Qatar play any role in those terms apart from the negotiations?
Not a very significant role. As compared to other countries, overall, Middle Eastern countries did not play. They had of course, their relationship with the government, diplomatic relationship with the government of Afghanistan from 2002 onwards. But significantly, they did not. There were education component that Qatar was involved in that. There were some scholarships for Afghans youth in Qatar, and there were some other trainings for at some level, very small level training for police that happened there. And overall, the capacity building, training, education, that was the area where Qatar was involved, but did not play a very significant role in other economic development of the country as compared to the other countries that played. So just going back to my point about the neutrality now, the political component of the Qatar role. So now, was Qatar a role effective in Afghanistan peace process or political processes? Well, I would say no. Though there are arguments coming from other camp that Qatar played a very significant role in Afghanistan peace processes, I would say no, Qatar did not play that role. Why? I have two major theses behind that. First, as a mediator, neutrality is extremely important. And countries should play a really neutral role, because otherwise the process will be influenced by different agenda.
Sure.
Yes.
Dr. Sakhi, sorry to interrupt you. We will come back to the issue of whether Qatar did play any interested. I mean, did it remain entirely impartial and disinterested on the fence regarding these processes? We will come back to that point later in the discussion. However, I would like to move to Dr. Roberts. Dr. Sakhi touched on important topics in her discussion. Most importantly, the issue of mediation. Qatar has been known as a as a hakam in the region. It has tried to play an outsized role in the negotiations between different conflicting parties and Lebanon and Libya and Sudan and Chad and Palestine. And recently in Afghanistan, as we saw, based on the reflections of Dr. Sakhi, how would you fit Qatar's position regarding the Taliban within the country's larger foreign policy discourse in the last few decades, especially after Amir Hamad al-Sani's coup d'etat? The country has tried a foreign policy drive to be sort of a demediating country in the Middle East. Was the negotiations between the US and the Taliban sort of another neutral, impartial balancing act played by Qatar between different parties, among whom it did not decide on taking a side, or did it remain impartial between these two sides, or it aligned itself with one of them at any point? The floor is yours, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you very much, and indeed, thank you for the invitation to speak about these things. So, my students have a lovely phrase that when they present second or third in a given event, they always complain that the person before them has stolen their sandwiches, and they've said things that they were going to say. So Dr. Sakhi has stolen and nibbled at a few of my sandwiches, but thankfully I have many other sandwiches to discuss. So let me try to offer a broader, to situate a lot of these policies that we're speaking about in the wider context of Qatari foreign policy. And if you feel that I haven't answered your question, then definitely just come back to me and I'll be delighted to try to. So my punchline answer to what Qatar has been up to in Afghanistan that I will sort of try to explain, I think, is that I think Afghanistan is a completely instrumental issue for Qatar, which is to say, Qatar, in a brutal kind of a sense, doesn't care all that much about Afghanistan and the issue there. Rather, it is a means to an end, and it's a means to the end of solidifying Qatar's critical relationships in Washington. That's the broad way that I see this, and I'll try and situate that kind of a conclusion. So before we start, we need to have a little think about Qatar. It's a small place in a dangerous part of the world. It has the population of Wolverhampton, if you're in the UK, Plano, Texas, if you're in the States, Kunduz in Afghanistan, very, very small. And that influences a lot. Chemnitz, if you're in Germany, Dr. Sakhi rightly talked about the German rule quite a bit. As we know, it is situated in a very violent region. There has been at least, a significant conflict every decade in the Gulf for many, many decades now. And Qatar shares a very large gas field with Iran and looks somewhat concerningly to Saudi Arabia, the other regional behemoth on the other side. And so this is the situation for Qatar, for a leader in Qatar. It is a difficult situation to secure the state. So that's the question. In the situation you're in with an extremely small population in a tricky region, how do you secure the state? And different leaders have had different approaches to that. So the grandfather of the contemporary emir, Khalifa bin Hamid, ruled 1972 to 1995, but to the late 80s in reality. His answer to that tricky question was to hide, in essence, under the auspices of Saudi Arabia. How do you secure yourself in a difficult region, a difficult world? Keep your head under the parapet. That was his approach. Qatar's foreign policy was minimal, in essence, during that age. And towards the late 80s, the father of the current emir being Tamim bin Hamid, his father, Hamid bin Khalifa, he took over in the late 1980s from his father, in all but name in the late 80s. And Hamid had a very different idea, a very different answer to the question. Again, the question is, how do you secure yourself? How do you secure Qatar? His answer was, no, we do not want to hide away. In fact, we need to be in the international limelight. We need to have a very significant presence on the international arena. And so he went about that in various ways. There are also economic components to this about diversification away from oil and gas and the likes. And then, of course, Hamid and his allies are the most important actors in Qatar in the late 1980s. And in 1990, Kuwait is invaded. The small Gulf monarchy of Kuwait is demolished in a couple of days by invading Iraqi forces. And this is the ghost of Christmas potential futures for Qatar, another rich, small, comparatively defenseless Gulf monarchy. So it shows that the sum of all fears can actually happen. The worst thing, it's unlikely to happen, but it can happen, is the lesson, is the point, is the problem. And so this brings in the US to the equation ever more. And of course, the operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in 1990 and 1991 precipitate the involvement of the US in the Gulf region to a completely unparalleled level, whereby partly for the operations, but thereafter, enormous US military bases are established up and down the Arabian Peninsula, and very much in Qatar. And in fact, Qatar very much encourages this. What Hamid bin Khalifa does, again, Hamid being the father of the contemporary emir, he effectively induces the US into ever greater relationships with Qatar. He builds this enormous military base, the Al Udeid Air Base, Qatari Air Force Base, on the largest runways in the Middle East, and basically says to his American friends, look at this beautiful airport that we have here. Look at this amazing runway. Wouldn't you love to base some of your planes here in perpetuity? And he induces American engagement like this, and that we're very successful in that regard. One of the critical nodes of US command and control for an entire segment of the world, including Afghanistan, of course, CENTCOM, Central Command, is based in Doha, based at this airbase. And so the question, how do you secure yourself in this dodgy region from Iran, maybe Saudi, whatever threats that arrive are, well, we need the economic visibility, the political visibility, but we definitely need to boost our relations with Uncle Sam. I wrote an article some decade or so ago about this lens of Qatar's foreign policy through the lens of doing what it can to engender, to create better relations with the US. And I think that we can definitely see Afghanistan and the Taliban negotiations in this way, as it were. So, as was outlined better than I could possibly do it, there was this incremental engagement with Germany's help, with Qatar and the Taliban, ultimately leading to the opening of the office in 2011, 12, perhaps one of my colleagues will correct me. And I don't think that, the alternative explanation that is sometimes offered is that, well, Qatar is a Muslim state, of course, and Qatar, we often see the state engaging with Islamist actors around the wider region. And this is an obvious truth. Different Muslim Brotherhood actors, perhaps Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria back in the day, Hamas, and the Taliban. The argument goes, well, obviously there is a clear trend here. Qatar wants to engage and support these more and less radical Islamist orientated groups. And I understand that argument, and I think there is a logic to it, but I disagree with it in essence. I see it all being far more instrumental, far more pragmatic than that, to be perfectly honest. And I think Qatar made a bet, basically, in mid-2000s, but particularly from 2000 and sort of with the opening of the office, which is very difficult and fraught. They raised the flag at one stage of the Taliban, quickly brought it back down when the Qataris were very angry because Karzai was very angry with that and the likes. It was a very tricky kind of a situation. But the bet that the Qataris made was that America is involved in this horrible and intractable conflict in Afghanistan, and it's going to have to end at some stage. And I think part of the very basic, aside from that, part of the rationale was there were lots of examples. They might be apocryphal, and I will be corrected on this, but I think there were examples in the 2000s of basically random individuals, chances we might call them, individuals going up effectively to NATO forces and saying, oh yes, I will be a key intermediary between you and the Taliban. And they were invested with some support and some money, and then it just disappeared. And so there was a fundamental problem of who do we engage it with? Very difficult, but Qatar sort of helped with that problem. And then with Bo Bergdahl, as we've heard and we've mentioned, and then with the ultimate drawdown, Qatar played a critical role. Now, all I mean by a critical role is a basic role. Dr. Sakhi is absolutely right to talk about the different types of mediation. And I suspect I will learn from her, to be honest, specifically in terms of what type of mediation the Qataris engaged in. There is a spectrum, is all I'm referring to, between broadly offering what is described as good offices to, you know, the leader getting involved in the nitty gritty of all the negotiations. And other experts here can comment on that better than I can. But my basic understanding is that Qatar was doing little more than offering space and offices. I don't know its engagement was all that in depth, unlike, for example, in 2008 with the Lebanese negotiations to offer a counter. And so I think that was Qatar's kind of a goal. I don't think it had any even hint of an Islamist agenda, really. I think it was just about trying to be that player where, you know, the line used to be from about Washington, you know, when I want to ring Europe, who do I call, as it were, speaking to the European sort of the EU, what's that? Do I ring Germany, Britain, whatever is it, France? Whereas for this issue, the Qataris wanted to be, for the US president, okay, I want to get this issue, I want to engage with someone on this issue. Of course, it was now impossible for the US to engage directly for the Taliban for a very, very long time. But who do I speak to? And the Qataris had the answer to that. It's us. It's Qatar providing, as on many occasions, a critical niche role for Uncle Sam in order, I would argue, to ultimately kind of buttress Qatar's security.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. So rather important points. Dr. Roberts touched on the fact that, building on Dr. Sakhi's points, that it has largely played the role of a mediator, tried to remain impartial, and has followed its own pragmatic priorities, and notably trying to solidify its relations with the US, rather than being seen as taking sides with extremists in the region. Dr. Roberts also pointed out the typology of mediation, right? So what type of mediation has Qatar played during the US-Taliban negotiations? It has not been as hands-on as it was in the Lebanese case, but it has nonetheless played this venue providing, facilitating party to these negotiations. Sort of the party that you would call when you need a venue, an impartial mediator in the region, regardless of any kind of political interest. However, I would like to refer that issue to Dr. Khenjani, Mr. Khenjani, Abdullah Khenjani, who used to be quite engaged, and he was involved in the processes and the negotiations and the last stages of the negotiations after the Doha agreement, especially when the delegation of the former Afghanistan Republic went to Doha to sit directly with a delegation of the Taliban, which was led by one of its most important ideologues, Mr. Abdul Hakim Haqqani, who is right now the chief of the Taliban Supreme Court. I would like Mr. Khenjani to reflect on the type of mediation that Qatar provided during this process. Did it in any way sway the content of the negotiations, or it remained outside and only fulfilled its part as it is understood by a neutral mediator? The floor is yours, Mr. Khenjani.
Thank you, Dr. Rafi, for moderating this conversation today. Actually, I'm out of any sandwiches that Dr. David was talking about. That's why I have to come up with a Afghani qabli palau. So excuse my scattered idea, because qabli palau is a scattered food. Like, you could never find any other food in the world that raisin, carrots, and rice with meat could get together. Anyways, I would like to also take this opportunity to begin with a disclaimer. I have been part of the senior leadership negotiation, visiting many times in Qatar during the Afghan negotiation, and I am very personally and institutionally thankful of the Qataris' generous and warm hospitality. They have given wonderful protocols to us, and my conversation today is not feeding the idea of all Afghans being ungrateful when their business is done. And I would like to take this opportunity to give a deeper context of what has happened. In addition, I always very thankful of my very good friends at the Afghanistan Institute Strategic Studies for taking the conversation from the current affairs to more important topics. I think it's important to remind ourselves that the current situation in Afghanistan is correlated to what has happened in the past. If I may start by briefly reviewing the history, I think that's important. The idea of Qatar become as a host for the peace negotiation in Afghanistan was presented in 2001 in 2011, my apologies, by the Americans for the President Karzai. There was a tough negotiation for 2 years. I would like to also remind everyone that post-2001 was very important for the United States, I think, Afghanistan and the Middle East, and the correlation of these three. For the Americans, I think it was the time that the Afghan conflict has become internalized, and President Obama wanted to take the issue into the electoral politics in the United States to attend more votes. In the meantime, there was a serious concerns about the Guantanamo prison, and I think that was part of the electoral promise of President Obama to relocate the prisoners on that time. So a new place was needed for this. And of course, a negotiation for United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think when we are talking about negotiation, we should really think two aspects of this negotiation. This negotiation was not only about peace in Afghanistan, but it was also about a safe and a honorable exit, what Americans wanted to say, from Afghanistan by receiving a safe passage from Afghanistan. For the Middle East also, it was important, was the time that the United States started to diversify its relations beyond the order of big brother, Saudi Arabia's big brother order in the Middle East. I think Qatar was one of the candidates to be included deeply into the US foreign policy. And for the Qataris, as Dr. Robert rightly put into perspective, like it was an important opportunity to take this with the United States, and they not only diversified their relationship with the countries in the region. I think they wanted to extend their resources and their networks to help United States to balance between not only Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Israel, but also Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan in its Middle East relationship and foreign policy. In 2011, the idea, when the idea was presented to Karzai was very resistant. He was not happy with the idea of a new office for the Taliban. And this 2 years of negotiation finally ended with, at the beginning, President Karzai wanted an agreement independently between Afghan government and the Qataris to be signed to determine the terms and conditions of the new office While during the negotiation, the United States could not manage such a blocking between Qataris because Qatar was not very involved post 2001 in Afghanistan compared to the Saudi Arabia and Emirates, United Emirates. So United States was replacing them in the negotiation. They ended up by exchanging two important letters, I think, official notes that we really need to have access on that today. That's important for when we are talking. A note which was exchanged between the Qataris and the Obama administration, and there was another official note which was exchanged between President Obama and President Karzai on 2013, which led to the initiation of the office of the Taliban in Doha. I think the letter with the Afghan side that should be in the archive of Palace, or with the President Karzai. I really hope that the people around him could give more context. What was the terms and condition? Dr. Nilofar also mentioned some of the terms and conditions, but I think the most important element of this letter was that this office should be only used for negotiation, just purely for negotiation. And that's all. It should be for the peace process. But on the other hand, the Taliban took this opportunity, and the Taliban leadership was under huge pressure of Pakistani government on that time. I think they sought this opportunity as a wonderful opportunity for them, and they have also been incentivized by the fancy life that the new sanctuary and the new house wanted to provide them. So there was a transition of a group of people from Pakistan to Qatar. And in the meantime, I think the United States wanted also to create, there was a theory in the United States among the NATO that in order to have an efficient negotiation with the Taliban, we have to build a moderate leadership for the Taliban. And I think Qatar was mandated by the United States to do so. So they took some of the people, including Mullah Brother on that time, out of the jail in Pakistan. They brought some of the people out of the prison in Guantanamo, and they started, the Qatar started to invest on all of them, urbanize them, gave them resources, gave them, education. Some of them were receiving, as Dr. Sakhi mentioned, even English language skills and negotiation tactics by the Norwegian and the German's counterpart of the government of Afghanistan on that. Their family was also welcomed there. They used to be receiving a monthly stipend. So this was a new opportunity. It was, but at the broader stage, I think, at broader perspective, Qatar also started to give the biggest international exposure to the Taliban, because Pakistan was in a state of denial for harboring the sanctuaries of the Taliban. They couldn't be able to do so in post 2001, but the Qatar government was not very shy to provide such an opportunity. There is also an important element for myself, honestly. I really hope that I could present it precisely here. There was a lot of similarities between, if you look at the nature of the power in Qatar and the Taliban as a movement. I used to always tell to my friends and colleagues that the similarity between us representing American semi-democratic order was less than the Taliban representing such a movement to the Qatari system of governance and structure in Qatar. What I mean by, if you look at the nature of power structure in Qatar, you would easily see that it's a very polished country, a very rich country. This rule of law is wonderful. I think the service delivery is so high, but in the meantime, it's an autocratic system. a group of people, either it's inside a family or the network of a family, they're controlling the power. And of course, the decision making is a top-down approach. And if you take this tailored framework and put it on the Taliban, if you would be a Taliban leadership, you would easily find yourself very similar to such a structure, and coming a group of people from a very diverse background, from a semi-democratic country, who have the ability to speak with Americans and deal directly with Americans. I think this difference is influenced so much the negotiation in the course of time. The Qataris were so sympathetic, and as well as the Taliban towards each other, and they used to be with us. But of course, we have to also mention that in our side, corruption was one of the most discrediting element of our efforts for peace, while I have no idea how the Taliban was managing such a super 1% controlled system of negotiation on that time. So that's another discussion to be moved with it, maybe in a different occasion. The Afghan peace process also coincides, I think, with a very important milestone for Qatar. It happened during the time that Qatar was facing with the blockage.
I would just remind that we have 2 minutes left.
Okay, I will finish it. Blockage. So during the blockage, I think the Qataris shifted from being a host to more invest on the Taliban as one of their instruments of their foreign policy, as a lifeline in order to save themselves from this blockage and keep their direct contact with the United States, and using Afghanistan peace process as a reminder for the United States that they have their own problems too, to be noted if they are asking for something in the course of time. So maybe in the next round, if there was a question, I would go into more details of how the Qatar has shifted from being a neutral host in the context of Afghanistan, when we are talking about negotiation and the international role that the Qatar played in other peace negotiation. I think we need to differentiate between all of them. Afghanistan was a specific case because of its complexity internally, regionally, and internationally. And I think that's important to be discussed with more details. Thank you, Dr. Rafi. And as I said, it's a Qabli Palau. I let everyone to draw its own conclusion.
That was quite an efficient, insightful Qabli Palau, Mr. Khenjani. Thank you for your remarks. But to summarize what Khenjani discussed, I would sum it up by saying that Qatar somehow played the role of a mediator, in a sense that it did influence the negotiations in many ways, notably by picking which players among the Taliban should be brought to Doha, sort of representing the moderate face of the Taliban in the negotiations. That was probably the most significant way that Qatar played a role in the negotiations between the US and the Taliban. And in a sense, Qatar also needed Afghanistan, the US-Taliban negotiations, to escape from the blockade that was imposed on it by the Gulf Cooperation countries, especially by Saudi Arabia. The country provided an option for the US as well to move away from a Saudi-centric policy in the region. And it also ties to the points that Dr. Roberts mentioned, that Qatar was using this to solidify its role. It's played an important role that was also related to the domestic politics in the US, especially the closure of the Guantanamo Bay in the US and the whole chapter of the US military presence in Afghanistan, and how it was important to sort of bring in a country like Qatar to facilitate the US's exit from the country. Now, I'll refer to Dr. Sakhi, a question related to, as mentioned by Mr. Khenjani, Qatar provided this venue for negotiations, which was based on the letters that Mr. Khenjani referred. The office was meant only to be used for negotiations. Was this opportunity used by the Taliban and the Pakistanis more than it was initially intended for? Were they proactive and using it in many other ways other than it was initially intended? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I have so much to say about the political peace processes of Afghanistan, and why I don't see a genuine peace process ever happened in Afghanistan. I mean, there's so much, as Dr. Robert mentioned, Mr. Khenjani mentioned, there are so much political elements, geopolitics. There's so much of this regional power and global power interest in that part of the region, especially in relation to Afghanistan, that never allowed a genuine peace process to happen. And that never happened, especially the cases that I did my research from 2010 and then 1980s peace process. I would say that never happened. So now I'm going to come back to your question. With Qatar role, exactly the same thing happened. There was so much politics involved rather than a genuine peace process to deal with the differences and bringing parties together and create a settlement among the parties. So that did not really was a genuine effort, which should be a part of a peace process, and which is the role of mediator actually. And that's why I'm coming back to the role of an office of the Taliban and the role of Qatar, which of course Qatar did play its role as mandated its foreign policy as a mediator, but its close relationship with the Taliban since 2005 onwards, for me, I see that there was always a soft corner for the Taliban from Qataris. And soft corner, whether it is ideologically associated, as Mr. Khenjani has mentioned, the autocratic system of regime that Qatar has, or this religious lens, if we bring that, if it's an ideological association or it's a political association, but that soft corner was there and built over time for Taliban. And that is wrong in the peace processes. That shouldn't happen. A mediator should not have a one-side approach. I'm not saying totally that was the main reason of the collapse of the peace processes. There are so many other elements, but I think mediator role has an influence on the process. And that soft corner of Qatar for the Taliban did have its influence on the processes overall. The other element, which I think it associated with the Taliban's office, political office in Qatar, is that from 2010 onwards, when the first negotiation started between the Taliban and the United States on that prisoner swap, there was a very strong criticism from President Karzai on the process, and not only on the process, on the establishment of that office. Now, I'm analyzing the process. I'm an analyst here, not really taking any side, but you cannot exclude one party from the table of negotiations. And you cannot exclude the demand of one party from the table of negotiation. You should expect a result. That's not how peacemaking is happening. You know, you have to include all the perspectives, all the differences, all the ideologies, all the criticism, all the demands of the parties, which the government of Afghanistan since 2010 was kind of partially excluded from the process, even for the agreement or the establishment of the office, Taliban office in Doha. So that was the first exclusion and the first element that actually caused an exclusion of one party meaningfully from the table of negotiations. And that was an alarm for the peace processes to produce a concrete result. And of course, we have so many other from 2018 peace process that I would not call the peace process. I would call the withdrawal process, that was by no means a peace process for Afghanistan. That was completely a withdrawal process, and naming it a peace process would be really causing danger to the whole concept of peacemaking, because of so many elements that I think it's out of scope of this panel that we're talking about, but that was not really as a process. Now, the role of a Qatar office, I think I would see it beyond the negotiations. It played a role of establishing Taliban's portfolio, the new portfolio. It played a role of connecting Taliban with the rest of the world, right? And it actually created that linkage of one party at the conflict, which has been Taliban, with the broader world, which Europe was there, the Middle Eastern countries, and of course, the South and Central Asia also. So I would see that the office played that role, giving a different, as Mr. Khenjani mentioned also, I think giving a profile to the new version of the Taliban, introducing new version of the Taliban, and that did not play a neutral role of negotiations only. I would conclude it that way. I stop there, Mr. Rafi.
Thank you, Dr. Sakhi. So to pick on some of the points that Dr. Sakhi mentioned, Afghanistan has been ridden with various peace processes that were not genuinely neutral. And along that line of successive players, Qatar has, according to Dr. Sakhi, not played a neutral role. It has had a soft corner for the Taliban. However, I would want to ask this question from all the panelists. Was the exclusion of the Afghan government early on in the process, either by the US or by Qataris, eventually did it not eventually lead to the Qataris having only the Taliban as the interlocutor? Was it not the case that merely out of a practicality that Afghan government was not included early on in the negotiations, that the Qataris got more and more close to the Taliban and their players that were moved from Pakistan to Doha? I would invite Mr. Khenjani to reflect on this first.
Well, when we are talking about neutrality in a peace process, I think it's problematic. There is no neutral mediator in any peace process in the world. I mean, if you did look into that. With the Afghan peace process, let me borrow what Dr. Chomsky used to say about the peace process. He used to say that there is a dictionary definition for the peace process, and there is an instrumental way in United States foreign policy when they wanted to intervene somewhere or to withdraw from somewhere, they contextualize as a process under the name of a peace process. Honestly, the whole tragic theater that we have been engaged for more than 2 years in Qatar, if you look at today from a more cold mind, you would see that there was no negotiation as such. There was an agreement between the Taliban and the United States, facilitated by the Qataris and endorsed by the Pakistanis, for the safe withdrawal of the United States within a confinement of a time limit. And the rest was just like using narratives, twisting, I think, blame games against each other. And now I do see even a more dangerous pattern by the most of the West-based academia and think tanks, that they are trying to condemn and to blame the local players for such a failure. and that has been the case in the 90s too, with the Russian, with the Soviet Union client in Afghanistan too. So I don't buy the idea of the neutrality in any peace process, but I think Qatar could have played more constructive role. And why this theory has gone wrong, I think it's important to look at also in one past year, because the Taliban is now ruling the country. In 2017, I think, there was an idea, there was a theory emerged in the policy circles that there is an opportunity to turn the Taliban to a proxy group, to a disloyal element of the Afghan society. Sadly, I mean, the whole structure in Afghan government in a past 2001 order was like our security forces was a rentier security force for the United States and the NATO, honestly. We were giving the ultimate sacrifices for gathering information and just give it to the West. And we were fighting on behalf of the region too, the region that Afghanistan is their problem now. It's not about only with the West, it was also, and nobody appreciates such a sacrifices and such a contribution to that process, including the Qataris, the United States, and the malign actors on that time against the peace process. And within that context, I think it's important to note that this theory is not giving the fruit or giving the production that was being predicted on that time. I think Taliban, along with Pakistan, played enough smart to project such an impression for the Americans that they could be one of the biggest element of the United States geopolitical game in the region, not only in South Asia but also in Central Asia and Middle East, including Iran. But this theory is not working today. I mean, the Taliban is more a complex group, and even if we examine their relation today with the Qataris, despite Qataris has played the similar role that the Pakistan had for the Taliban in the 90s, now there is a lot of grievances and frustration, and Taliban are diversifying their relationship in the Middle East. The Kabul airport contract and many other airport contract is one of the it's the tip of the iceberg, if I may say. There is a lot of conversation. I just heard that just this week, the defense minister of the Taliban may visit Emirates for a series of conversation how to diversify their relationship there too. Great. So if I will stop here.
Okay, thanks, Khenjani. I would I would also invite the audience to register their questions. So now we're open for Q&A. We're live on Twitter and Facebook. Please do leave your questions in comments. To build on Dr. Sakhi and Mr. Khenjani's point, I would want to ask Dr. Roberts. The fact that neutrality doesn't mean anything in political negotiation, or that there is an ambiguity in the semantics of the word neutrality. Can we rightly claim that Qatar has remained pragmatic and neutral in the negotiations, in the US-Taliban negotiations, especially as the country has been previously accused of being quite lackluster with its counterterrorism policies in the region? For one of the members of the royal family was actually accused of close ties with Al-Qaeda, with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He was put out under house arrest. He was the interior minister of Qatar, and especially Sheikh Tamim al-Thani is recognized as more religious than his father. Would you not say that the alignment with extremists is more ideological, whereas the relationship with other parties such as Israel and the US and, for instance, some secular forces is merely for building an image of an impartial player? There, on the one side, there is genuine ideological tendency. On the other side, there is mere politics, a tactical sort of strategy to project a neutral image. How would you reflect on this, Dr. Roberts?
So yeah, some interesting points that have been raised. So a very quick little bit of context is that before the Arab Spring, 2010, 2011, generally speaking, Qatar was perceived as being far more neutral than after the Arab Spring. Again, we can quibble, and we should, because the detail is interesting. But broadly speaking, after the Arab Spring, we can construct a decent argument that Qatar increasingly chose sides and increasingly channeled its support to more and more actors on the Islamist spectrum, actively chose sides in Syria, Tunisia, Egypt, and the like. So that's kind of a clear part of the background there. I would still probably say that it was broadly instrumental rather than religiously driven. There are legitimate and good arguments against that, as it were. And so your question about whether, you know, their engagement with the US and Israel is one thing, with Hamas, the Taliban, or whomever, is more about your ideological tendencies and the likes that you referred to. And we can, that's, you know, that's a perfectly reasonable argument to make there. I would probably say it's a bit of a distinction without a difference, in the sense that it is, to my mind, still pragmatic. And the key kind of rationales as to why Qatar was pursuing the kind of policies it was, you know, whether with Hamas or Jabhat al-Nusra or the Taliban or whomever, is, like I say, is more pragmatic. And so if you have your Dr. Sakhi's language about a soft corner or the likes, and yes, I'm sure Qatar had built relations with one particular actor in a given conflict situation, the Taliban. Qatar therefore had money, time, and engagement invested in that actor. So to my mind, it's, I don't know what the added value of saying, well, was it a religious alliance of some sort of sense? Was it an ideological alliance? Or was it just, well, Qatar wanted to maintain its engagement. Qatar wanted to maintain its place at the table, wanted to maintain Doha as the venue. So Qatar had to kind of follow, champion a little bit the actors that it was closer to. I think, to my mind, that's my explanation. Perfectly, as I say, legitimate arguments to the contrary. And one other thing, I mean, this question about whether Qatar was a useful actor in achieving some kind of peace. I mean, I might cynically say that that wasn't necessarily Qatar's end goal at any stage. I mean, that would be a lovely end goal for Qatar. They would have loved to have overseen some glorious mythical peace in Kabul between the actors. But as I've said, the central goal to my mind for the Qataris is about facilitating Uncle Sam, facilitating the US. And first and foremost, the central goal for the US is extracting themselves from this catastrophe in which they found themselves. I don't mean that in a passive way, they created it as well, of course, but it's enabling the US to get out is the first goal. If Qatar could have enabled that while creating some glorious peace, then wonderful. But that's not necessarily, I think, what they sort of were aiming for.
Just to add here, Dr. about what Dr. Roberts said, let's not confuse two processes. There are two different processes when we talk about the settlements. One is the political process, other is the peace process. The political process, of course, neutrality is not an element, right? I mean, countries have their interests, powers have their interests, and all the parties have their interests going forward. And the mediator role, to be honest, is not really focused on neutrality. That's a political process. Exactly what happened in Doha, that was a political process. But the peace process, if you are really focusing on the peace processes, peace processes, neutrality is an important element. If a mediator is incapable to ensure that neutrality, that party shouldn't be a mediator. That's a very strong line. That's actually a red line in the peacemaking processes. Neutrality of the venue, neutrality of the mediator is an important element and has an impact on the success and failure of peace processes around the world that we have seen. So Qatar, Germany, Norway, Ireland, if they want to bring themselves and this peacemaking industry as a neutral mediator, they have to be clear about the stand they are taking against or for any party. They have to have certain rules of engagement with the parties. Otherwise, they should not call themselves or bring themselves under this platform of a neutral mediator, because then they are actually not doing that well. So therefore, what Qatar role has been, Qatar demonstrated itself as in other conflict as a mediator. And if it says in its foreign policy that it's there to resolve the conflict and to end to the conflict, so that means that it clearly says about its role as a mediator. And the mediator, the important characteristics of mediator is a neutrality. If Qatar is not able to maintain that with the passage of time, I think it will undermine its credibility in this particular field of peacemaking. So that has to be considered seriously by Qataris going forward with this peacemaking notion. The other elements attached to it, this Dr. Rafi, just important. It's also not important for the peace processes to be successful, to produce a successful result, right? So for example, in Afghan process, a peace or withdrawal process, the peace settlement was a component of Doha deal. That was a fourth component of Doha deal through intra-Afghan negotiations. Okay, President Ghani fled the country, the Taliban entered by force to Kabul. There are all other elements and factors that did not happen, the political settlement happened. So this was an incomplete process. This did not actually happen. That's why and it was a failure. Not because of Qatar now, because of the Doha engagement. I would not bring that as an element. There are many other factors, as mentioned, the president of the country fled, the one party entered by force, and so many other technicality on the battlefield that not the scope of this panel to discuss. But overall, that did not produce any result, though the peace process failed. Right? But the political process, the withdrawal element, that succeeded, right? That succeeded with the further engagement of the two countries, I mean, on the issues of Afghanistan, which was the Taliban, my apologies, Qataris and the United States. Now they work together on the issue of Afghanistan. So that relationship actually strengthened out of that process. But for Afghanistan process, if we call it as a peace process, Qatari role was not really significant and important.
That really, thanks, Dr. Sakhi and Dr. Roberts. This relates to the question put forward by Christian Berg-Hartwig. There were many other hosts of the negotiations between the US and the Taliban. So the question is, how did Qatar relate to initiatives by other countries to host talks? Two examples, specifically, the Murray quadrilateral talks hosted by Pakistan, the planned intra-Afghan talks to be hosted by Norway in fall 2019, derailed by President Trump's Camp David initiative. Given that Qatar has such an existential interest in preserving its hosting role, did it fight, undermine, or support these initiatives? Mr. Khenjani, can I invite you to reflect on?
Thank you. Well, in the peacemaking complex, or then the peacemaking lucrative business, if you look at it as a business politically and from a geopolitical and security prospects, being a host, being a mediator is not a responsibility. It's an opportunity, it's a privilege, and it's a business for the countries. So there was so much competition, sadly, not only by the Qataris, but also by the Germans and the Norwegian, in order to influence the both parties to have the opportunity to host the peace process. I'm sad to say sometimes even, I sometimes really don't know when I'm looking back to these diplomats, because I was a silent note taker in the most of these high-level meetings with these people. I mean, I admire their revisionism, to be honest. But these three countries started to deeply invest on both sides and both parties players in order to attain and gain influence to hijack, if I may say, to hijack the process. There was a lot of sympathy in Kabul for the Norwegian and especially for the Germans, because the German diplomats has a good relation. They built up good relation through giving a lot of opportunities and resources, if I may say very generally, to the negotiation members and also the people around President Ghani to convince them to have the negotiation in Berlin. And in 2019, even they have reserved during the COVID one of their palace somewhere for a round of negotiation. But contrary to such an initiative and competition, Qataris use their influence and resources on the Taliban sides to block such an initiative. While there was some sort of idea later in 2020, that this negotiation since is not making any result in Doha, and the Taliban are using from the home advantage opportunity there should be some sort of a secondary place. And the Germans were very active, Norwegians were very active on both sides. And that's where most of the European countries sadly compromise most of their principal positions for the sake of influencing the Taliban and making a good so-called good friendship with the Taliban through this process. So if I may conclude that there was a combination of cooperation, competition, and sometimes blocking each other and acting against each other. With Pakistan, I think there was one thing very clear, that no one in Kabul was seeing Pakistan as a neutral player, but they were very pragmatic. I think they had a very interesting idea to be noted now. Firstly, they were talking as a first country to say that they are ready to carry on a intra-Afghan negotiation beyond the state with the broader constituencies in Afghanistan. And secondly, they were always telling us, the government in Kabul, that the key players are sitting still in Pakistan as we see it today. And there was a huge encouragement by the Pakistanis to come and talk with them there instead of just wasting your time in Doha.
My next question from you, Mr. Khenjani, is actually just related to the internal processes of the negotiations. So can we even talk of a unitary country as Qatar? I mean, there are many elements in Qatar itself, its security establishment, its foreign policy, the Emir himself. Were there organizations and parties that played a part in different ways within the internal negotiation process of the Doha process? Which actors played what roles and whose interests? If you could reflect a bit on that aspect.
Well, there was a great cooperation, interagency cooperation between the Qatari establishment. I think Amir himself was very involved in the process. And I still remember that he was following the developments of on the daily developments. Once we were last July, 2020 July, and we were about to reach to a joint declaration with the Taliban, and then later that evening go to have a state dinner with Amir, which the Taliban did not agree for a joint declaration of that meeting. So the Amir did cancel the official dinner on that night, meaning that he was himself closely following, even on minutes basis, the peace negotiation in Afghanistan. And that was not because of Afghanistan, because of us, because of the Taliban. It was all because of the Americans. I think there was.
How about non-state actors in Qatar? think tanks, the media, and even non-Qatari players that were sort of swaying or playing a part in that?
I mean, this think tank enterprise is an interesting enterprise. There is nothing such as impartiality in any part of the world, but in Qatar, all the portfolio of Afghanistan being given in the public to one of the Afghanistan, specialists. The gentleman went from London, the Palestinian gentleman, I forgot his name at the moment. He was at the University of York, and he was actually controlling the think tank academia and the universities of the Taliban. And sometimes it was tough to differentiate between whether he is a Taliban official himself or he is a host. Like I've never had any conversation with him, but that was our general impression, that he had a specific mandate with a lot of resources on his hands to promote the Taliban, to give them an opportunity to promotion of the Taliban was not like an accidental.
Can I briefly jump in when you're finished, Abdullah?
Please, Professor.
My apologies if I spoke over you there. Excuse me. The difficulties of Zoom.
Okay.
I think that question, I think, is a really good question as a general rule when coming at these sorts of issues. In the case of Qatar, and on this occasion, I don't really think it applies. The nature of Qatar is microscopic. It is a city state of 300,000 people. It is. I'm sure there are examples that we can think of where maybe there are internal issues that affect which speakers can come to the local mosque. I'm sure there is a certain amount of competition between Ministry of Awqaf and Islamic Endowments and the likes and other actors in Qatar. But on something like this, a significant foreign policy gambit, I just don't see, practically speaking, which actors are going to be competing here. We'll have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, but that is incredibly closely aligned to the Emir's Diwan. And so I don't really see how different actors could be pursuing different agendas. Al Jazeera, of course, is a sensible subject to bring up here, but everyone in Al Jazeera knows perfectly well what they can and what they can't cover. And so I don't even see Al Jazeera going out on a limb and critiquing state policy in that sort of a sentiment. As previous guests mentioned, other think tanks in Doha, they don't really have agendas in that kind of a sense. So a sensible question is a rule, but I'm not sure in this case if it applies.
Thank you from all the panelists. We are closing in on our towards the end of our time. I'd request all the panelists to briefly give their final remarks and restricted to 2 minutes, if you would. Thank you. I'll start with Dr. Sakhi.
Well, thank you. I talk a lot. I hope I'll confine myself within 2 minutes. As I mentioned, I think I'm not going to add anything new, but repeat what I said. As I mentioned before, the role of a mediator is an important peace processes. Afghanistan has had failed peace processes since 1980s onward. And one of the main reasons, because of the so many other political interests of the region and the global interest in the region. Afghanistan was not the Afghanistan peace was not really a major issue or agenda of the peace talks overall, if we see, though it designed that way to end into a political settlement and end the war. But when you see the nits and grits within the peace processes, that change differently, and the entire substance of the talk was not there after a few months when the talk began. Why? Because of this all lack of neutrality of different players and stakeholders. Not stakeholders have some mandates and interests, but at least the mediators and the conveners. So I think for that, it's important that any other political process which Afghanistan may have in future, which right now are at the table of some of the talks, that Afghanistan should convene a political process because there hasn't been any settlement at the end of the last process. So for any political process to happen in future, I think the neutrality of the place as a venue and neutrality of a convener is an important element to keep into consideration. If it comes under United Nations mandate, I think that neutrality should be ensured and protected. If any country in the region or in the world take the responsibility of that political process going forward, we don't know what's going to happen in future of Afghanistan. But if that is a mandate to start a political process, I think finding a neutral convener and finding a neutral moderator is an important element that add to the substance and the success of a political settlement to happen in Afghanistan. I stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Sakhi. Now I would invite Mr. Khenjani to give his final remarks.
With a positive note, I think our experience, because we have like 2 years of 10 years time engaging with each other in the Doha, I think these lessons are important for 4 categories of the countries in the world. Firstly, for Afghanistan, I think we have to reflect more among ourselves beyond emotional criticism and blame game, because that's not a strategy. Nobody gonna care about it, honestly. And you cannot fix any problem of us with this. Secondly, I think for the countries, specifically for the European countries, Norway and Germany, it's important to listen to us more and learn from these experience, because this experience will be beneficial for them in the future if they wish to be playing an international role as a mediator in the world. And thirdly, for the other running, I think there are few other countries that are facing with the same challenges that we are facing. I think if I would be like the person I am today, 2 years before now, I would have given more better advices to the people, to my seniors. I think it's important that they also listen to some of us who has the ability and integrity to talk about our own failure, specifically about our own failure. And lastly, I think for the think tanks and for the academics in the West, I think we have to give up the idea that we are the ultimate sources of knowledge and experience and theories. I think some of the theories are worth to be backed up by the people, the indigenous people. Maybe they don't have a good English knowledge, but they can contribute to the bigger understanding of the world. If we are wishing to fix the world, if we would like to just mess up everything, I think we have enough experience in messing up the world, and it continues for a long time. Thank you once again, Dr. Rafi, for your kind moderation, and my dear friends at AISS.
Thank you, Mr. Khenjani. Now I'd like Dr. Roberts to deliver his final remarks.
So, thank you very much. Just a quick note, again, thinking about the nature of Qatar and what maybe we can extrapolate from that in terms of its foreign policy. So I wrote in a Brookings paper a while ago that Qatar has a very similar population size to Iceland, some 300,000-ish, give or take. And Iceland has, with its population, it thinks, okay, we can have 20, 26 was the count I had, maybe up to 30 foreign missions, embassies and the likes. Why? Because, well, we're a state of, I don't know, 300-some thousand people, and that's realistically the size of a foreign staff that we can staff, as it were, that we can populate. Qatar, in contrast, has a similar population to Iceland, but has approximately 100 embassies and consulates. My point is, just think through the pragmatic ramifications of that. Just think through what that means when you have this small state with this hyperactive foreign policy here, there, and everywhere. Think of the thinness, how thin the coverage Qatar's foreign ministry necessarily has. I'm talking purely numbers here. I'm making a mathematical claim here. And so what does this mean? What does this say to the number of Afghan political experts that Qatar has? Mathematically speaking, if it had more than one or two, it would be an abject miracle. Of course it would. Again, I'm making a statistical claim here. So my point is that when Qatar engages left, right, and center, it is doing so not from this position where, more often than not, where it wants to delve into the detail of any given subject, because it can't. It does not have the expertise. It has got to buy expertise in, bring in consultants, of course, then it can engage. Another thing we see with foreign policy is the very strong dependence on specific individuals. We saw this in Libya in particular. But without those individuals deep in the process, in the depths of Kabul politics, or whatever the phrase is, Qatar is left sitting back, offering its good offices, trying to pursue its agenda, which is slightly more general rather than specific to the nature of the politics in Afghanistan, wherever. And I think that this is why I started off by talking about the population of Qatar, because from this, human resource issue, I think so much of the nature of Qatari foreign policy automatically follows and is limited. But anyways, I'll leave it there. And thank you again for the invitation, I should say.
Thank you, thanks, Roberts. That's a good way to actually bring an end to the discussion today. I would remind the audience again once more if they have any questions. Otherwise, we can conclude the event. I guess we had important topics discussed today regarding Qatar. Qatar being a country that has, according to Dr. Roberts, the question about the complexity of its internal dynamics doesn't really apply to Qatar, because it's a country that's quite run in a pragmatic and top-down manner. It has tried to play its role to solidify its links and relationships with the US during the US-Taliban negotiations. That has, according to Dr. Roberts, been its main priority. The fact that it has tried to align itself with the extremist groups is according to him, not the right determinant of the Qatari foreign policy. And Qatar has, according to Dr. Sakhi, has been quite disinterested in the larger reconstruction process in Afghanistan. However, it during 2001 to 2021, but stepped in and tried to lead as a host, as a facilitator of the peace negotiation between the US and the Taliban. However, according to Dr. Sakhi, Qatar has not remained genuinely neutral as other players who have also played a role in this process, as Pakistan, Germany, or Norway. A genuine neutral peace process, according to Dr. Sakhi, has been quite difficult to obtain. Qatar, despite its proclaimed neutrality, has inevitably led, Qatar's role has led inevitably to the legitimization of the Taliban from a group, an insurgent group, to a legitimate negotiation partner for the US. Also, after the Taliban's return to power in Kabul, we see that Qatar has tried to extend its support to consolidate the Islamic Emirates of Taliban's power in Kabul in many ways. Recently, the Qatari foreign minister at the UN General Assembly asked the world community to provide a roadmap to gradually potentially recognize the Taliban. Qatar has played a role, according to Mr. Khenjani, in a field peace process in which the Taliban got what they intended for, but the US side sort of withdrew its forces without the guarantees that the Taliban will deliver on their promises. as we are facing a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, coupled with the risk of security threats originating from Afghanistan due to terrorism, we would like to see how Qatar plays its role in this new political context. With that, I would like to conclude our panel today. Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts, Mr. Khenjani, and Dr. Nilofar Sakhi, to join us here. And I thank the Afghanistan Institute of Strategic Studies and all the audience who have followed this panel discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.